Fire? The young lieutenant asked, his hands hovering over the console. Major Lucas Bennett never looked up from the battered steel shell resting on the table beside his coffee mug. Not yet, he said quietly. Let them believe they understand us first. 3 days later, survivors from the Velker Expeditionary Fleet would swear that no warning siren, no advanced scanner, and no predictive battlefield intelligence had prepared them for what happened on the plains outside Fort Adams. They expected elegant energy weapons, brilliant beams cutting through the morning haze, and a clean, civilized battle fought according to every doctrine the galaxy respected. Instead, they found something older, simpler, and far more terrifying. Long before the first shell ever left its barrel, the battlefield looked almost disappointing. Rows of squat steel guns stretched across rolling farmland that had been converted into defensive positions months earlier. Mud clung to heavy tracked vehicles. Mechanics wiped grease from their hands. Soldiers tightened bolts, checked coordinates, and traded quiet jokes while waiting for breakfast to finish heating inside dented field kitchens. There were no dramatic speeches, no roaring crowds, just Americans doing what Americans had always done before difficult days, finishing coffee, checking equipment twice, and pretending they were not thinking about what came next. Private Nathan Brooks sat on an ammunition crate, turning the small silver wedding band on his finger. His wife back home in Missouri was 7 months pregnant. He had already watched the latest ultrasound video more times than he could count. Boy or girl? Another soldier asked as he walked past carrying a clipboard. Nathan smiled. We decided not to find out. Brave man. That's what my wife keeps telling me. They laughed for a moment, and the tension lifted just enough for everyone to breathe again. Across the line, Major Bennett moved from one artillery crew to the next with the calm rhythm of a high school football coach before kickoff. He never raised his voice. He never rushed anyone. He stopped beside one cannon, ran his hand across its weathered steel, then looked at the young gun chief. How's she feeling? Same as always, sir. Reliable. Always. Bennett nodded once. Good. Reliable wins wars. Nearly 12 miles away, High Marshal Kaler observed the human positions through orbital reconnaissance. The enormous tactical display floating before him highlighted every artillery battery in bright red. Officers around him struggled to hide their amusement. Primitive projectile launchers, one commander scoffed. They actually dragged those antiques across open ground. Another officer enlarged the image of a cannon wrapped in camouflage netting. No plasma emitters. No graviton accelerators. No quantum lances. They really intend to defend an entire continent with metal tubes. Kaler folded his arms. They are a young species. Every civilization clings to old habits before progress forces them forward. He smiled as more intelligence reports arrived. Good. The easier they are to predict, the faster this campaign ends. Back at Fort Adams, Bennett climbed onto the observation platform overlooking hundreds of silent artillery pieces disappearing into the morning fog. His radio crackled softly. Enemy fleet entering atmosphere. Every conversation stopped. Coffee cups were set down. Gloves tightened. Nathan slipped his wedding ring beneath his glove and took one long breath. Bennett raised a pair of binoculars, watching distant clouds begin to ripple as alien landing craft descended toward Earth. His face never changed. He lowered the binoculars, glanced once at the steel shell resting beside him, and quietly said, "Let's show them why humanity never stopped believing in artillery." The first alien landing craft pierced the cloud cover without urgency, gliding toward the open plains as though the outcome had already been decided. Their formation was flawless, every ship perfectly spaced, every movement synchronized by artificial intelligence refined over centuries of conquest. High Marshal Kaler stood aboard the command carrier with his hands behind his back, watching the tactical display update in real time. Green icons marked human artillery positions. Blue icons represented his advancing battalions. According to every simulation, the battle would be over in less than 28 minutes. One of his senior officers tilted his head toward the display. They have not repositioned. Kaler almost smiled. They believe fixed defenses will save them. They are preparing for the last stand every primitive civilization imagines before reality catches up. The bridge filled with quiet laughter. Nobody questioned him. Nobody needed to. Across dozens of campaigns, Kaler had never launched an invasion without overwhelming technological superiority. Human radar stations tracked the incoming fleet, but there was no panic inside Fort Adams. Operators calmly read coordinates over the radio. Engineers continued checking hydraulic pressure on every gun. Ammunition crews loaded fresh shells with practiced precision, each movement almost boring in its routine. Nathan Brooks watched another crew finish inspecting a weathered artillery piece whose faded paint revealed years of service. "How old is that thing?" he asked an older sergeant. The veteran patted the steel barrel with surprising affection. "Older than you." Nathan blinked. "And we still trust it." The sergeant grinned. "Son, the day you stop trusting something because it is old is the day you forget why it lasted this long." A transport truck rolled by carrying more ammunition. Drivers exchanged casual ways with soldiers standing beside the road. Someone complained about the coffee being cold. Another argued that the barbecue back in Texas was still better than anything served on base. The ordinary conversations almost made it easy to forget that hundreds of enemy ships were descending from orbit. Major Lucas Bennett walked into the Fire Direction Center carrying nothing more dramatic than a clipboard filled with handwritten notes. Captain Olivia Harper looked up from the digital map. "Orbital tracking confirms multiple landing zones." Bennett nodded. "Any surprises?" "No, sir. Exactly where we expected. Within 40 yards. Bennett placed the clipboard on the table. "Good." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Good. If they are predictable, we only have to do the math once." Around them, officers quietly exchanged updated firing solutions. Nobody shouted. Nobody slammed a fist on the table. Every order sounded more like co-workers preparing for another difficult Monday than soldiers facing an invasion. 12 miles away, alien dropships settled onto the fields beyond the river. Their ramps lowered with mechanical precision as armored vehicles rolled forward under shimmering defensive shields. Kaler watched through magnified optics as his ground commanders spread into textbook assault formations. "Begin electronic suppression," he ordered. "Blind their communications. Disable their targeting systems. Remove their ability to coordinate." Seconds later, reports flowed across the bridge. "Signal disruption complete. Orbital superiority confirmed. Human command network partially degraded." Another officer folded his arms confidently. "Their artillery will never receive synchronized firing data." Kaler nodded. "Then they have already lost." Back inside Fort Adams, several computer screens suddenly flickered before going dark. Nathan glanced toward the operations trailer. "Did we just lose the network?" Captain Harper answered before anyone else could. "Yes." Nathan swallowed hard. "What now?" Bennett calmly opened the weathered clipboard and spread several folded paper maps across the table. Every firing coordinate had been written by hand. Every battery already possessed printed backups. Every commander had memorized contingency procedures weeks earlier. Bennett looked around the room. "They assumed we would stop thinking without computers." A slow smile crossed his face as distant engines echoed across the valley. "They are about to discover that the oldest backup system on Earth is a well-trained human being." Outside, the morning fog finally began to lift, revealing endless rows of silent artillery stretching across the landscape, while the first alien armored columns crossed the river exactly where Bennett had hoped they would. The valley became so quiet that Nathan Brooks could hear the wind brushing across dry grass between the artillery positions. The silence felt wrong. Every instinct told him something should already be happening. Alien armored columns were crossing the river in perfect formation, their polished vehicles reflecting the early morning sun as if they were arriving for a parade instead of an invasion. He adjusted his helmet and looked toward Major Lucas Bennett. "Sir," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. "They are inside 12 miles. Bennett did not answer immediately. He studied the paper maps spread across the hood of an old utility truck, then checked a simple wristwatch that had probably seen more deployments than most of the soldiers standing nearby. "I know," he finally replied. Nathan hesitated. "Should we be firing?" Bennett folded the map with deliberate care. "Not yet." Captain Olivia Harper stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Our forward observers are asking the same question." Bennett looked toward the distant tree line where the alien columns continued rolling forward without resistance. They spent centuries fighting enemies that panic. He glanced at Harper. "We are going to give them something they have never experienced." A radio operator removed one earphone and frowned. "Enemy broadcasts are getting stronger." Harper switched frequencies. A translated transmission filled the command shelter. Human defenders, an unfamiliar voice announced with complete confidence. Your communications have collapsed. Your defensive systems have been neutralized. Lay down your weapons, and your personnel will be treated according to Galactic convention. Several younger soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. Nathan swallowed. They sound pretty sure of themselves. An older gunner named Frank Dawson chuckled while tightening the last bolt on his artillery carriage. That usually means they skipped the homework. Nathan looked at him. You are not worried? Frank shrugged. Son, I have been worried before tornadoes, before hurricanes, and before my daughter introduced me to her first boyfriend. This, he nodded toward the advancing fleet. This is just another problem with a solution. Laughter rolled through the gun crew, easing the tension for a few precious seconds. Miles away, High Marshal Kaler observed the same battlefield through orbital imaging. Human artillery remained completely silent. No repositioning. No retreat. No counterattack. His chief intelligence officer smiled. Their morale is collapsing. Kaler slowly shook his head. No, the officer looked surprised. Then why have they not fired? Kaler narrowed his eyes. Because they still believe they have a chance. He turned toward another commander. Advance every ground division. Double the pace. I want their batteries captured intact. The order spread instantly across the invasion force. Heavy vehicles accelerated. Landing craft continued unloading fresh equipment, while engineers projected shimmering defensive fields ahead of every advancing column. The alien commanders congratulated one another before the battle had truly begun. Back at Fort Adams, another observer called over the radio. Enemy has crossed checkpoint Echo. Harper looked at Bennett. They are exactly where we predicted. Bennett nodded once. Keep waiting. Nathan stared at him in disbelief. Sir, with respect, Bennett interrupted without raising his voice. Private Brooks, what happens if you pull a fish out of the water too early? Nathan blinked. You lose it. Exactly. Bennett looked toward the valley where every alien formation continued compressing into the narrow approach corridor. Sometimes patience is the loudest weapon you have. A deep rumble echoed across the hills as another wave of enemy vehicles entered the valley floor. Spotters rapidly updated fresh coordinates using binoculars, paper charts, and grease pencils. Every artillery battery quietly adjusted its elevation by fractions of an inch. Hundreds of steel barrels turned together so smoothly that the movement almost looked choreographed. Nathan watched the final adjustments finish one by one until every gun pointed toward the same invisible point beyond the horizon. His heartbeat quickened. Nobody spoke anymore. Bennett lifted the field telephone, listened for several long seconds, then slowly wrapped his hand around the receiver. Now, he said softly, they have finally stepped exactly where we wanted them. Major Lucas Bennett did not raise his voice. He simply lifted the field telephone, waited for the confirmation tone, and spoke a sentence so calm that Nathan Brooks almost questioned whether he had heard it correctly. Battery command, execute fire mission Alpha. All units, fire for effect. The words traveled through miles of buried cables and hardened radio relays. One after another, artillery crews acknowledged the order with the same quiet professionalism. Gun 1 ready. Gun 2 ready. Battery 3 ready. All sections standing by. Across the entire defensive line, hundreds of hands moved almost at the same time. Safety checks were completed. Final bearings were confirmed using paper charts that had already outlived 3 generations of military computers. Frank Dawson rested one hand against the steel breech of his gun and smiled at Nathan. You never forget your first one. Nathan forced a nervous grin. I thought it would feel different. Frank nodded. Everybody does. The valley remained peaceful for one final heartbeat. Alien armored columns continued advancing with perfect confidence, protected beneath shimmering energy fields that glowed like glass beneath the morning sun. High Marshal Kaler watched the battlefield from orbit, his tactical officers reporting steady progress every few seconds. Forward divisions have encountered no organized resistance. Excellent, Kaler replied. Maintain pressure. Capture their artillery intact. I want those weapons displayed in the Hall of Victory. An intelligence officer zoomed the display toward the nearest human battery. They are still stationary. Kaler gave a dismissive wave. They have already accepted defeat. At that exact moment, Bennett lowered his hand. The first cannon answered with a deep rolling boom that echoed across the hills. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet countryside transformed into a perfectly synchronized chorus of thunder as every battery joined the mission. Nathan felt the vibration through his boots before he fully understood what he was hearing. The air itself seemed to pulse as the artillery line worked like a single living machine. Empty shell casings rolled across reinforced platforms, while fresh rounds moved into place with practiced precision. Nobody celebrated. Nobody shouted. Every crew simply followed the same rhythm they had rehearsed countless times. Load. Confirm. Fire. Repeat. Miles away, alien sensor operators frowned at rapidly changing displays. Marshal, we are detecting multiple projectile launches. Kaler barely looked up. Estimate impact. Approximately. The officer hesitated while fresh calculations flooded across the screen. There are too many signatures. Another analyst leaned toward his console. Our tracking software cannot separate individual trajectories. Kaler finally stepped closer. Impossible. No, sir. The analyst swallowed. The volume exceeds the prediction model. Across the valley, the first shells reached their programmed destinations with remarkable precision. Earth shook beneath overlapping shockwaves as towering clouds of dust, smoke, and loose debris climbed into the sky, instantly hiding entire sections of the battlefield from every optical sensor. Alien commanders attempted to restore visibility through thermal imaging, but new impacts arrived before the previous clouds had settled. Reports began arriving from the front faster than officers could organize them. Visual contact lost. Navigation disrupted. Formation spacing compromised. Requesting updated battlefield picture. None of the reports mentioned panic. They mentioned confusion. For the first time since entering Earth's atmosphere, the invasion force no longer possessed a clear understanding of where anything was happening. Nathan stared across the valley in disbelief. Through binoculars, he could no longer see the neat enemy formations that had crossed the river only minutes earlier. The entire landscape had disappeared beneath layers of drifting dust and constant movement. Frank quietly loaded another shell. "Do not watch the target," he said. "Watch the clock." Nathan looked down. Every 30 seconds, another coordinated volley left the line. Every 30 seconds, the valley disappeared all over again. Bennett glanced at his watch, nodded once, and spoke into the field telephone. Phase 1 complete. Prepare for the rolling barrage. Captain Olivia Harper looked up from the updated firing map, her expression steady but unmistakably impressed. "They still think this was our opening move." Bennett allowed himself the smallest smile. "Good," he replied. "They have not even seen the plan yet." The rolling barrage began so quietly that the alien commanders almost missed what was changing. At first, they assumed the impacts were random corrections, the kind every inexperienced military made after discovering their aim was off. High Marshal Kaler watched new clusters appear across the tactical display and folded his arms. "They are adjusting fire after losing visual contact," he said confidently. "Maintain the advance." A navigation officer frowned at his console. "Marshal, the impact zones are moving." "Naturally." "No, sir. They are moving with us." Silence settled across the bridge. The officer enlarged the battlefield map. Every 30 seconds, the line of impacts advanced the exact same distance as the lead armored columns. Every adjustment arrived before the previous one finished. It was as if the human batteries already knew where the invasion force intended to be. "How are they predicting our movement?" another commander asked. Nobody answered. Back at Fort Adams, Captain Olivia Harper removed another transparent overlay from the paper map and placed a fresh one on top. Colored grease pencil lines stretched across roads, hills, rivers, and open farmland. Bennett nodded approvingly. "They followed the corridor exactly." Harper smiled. "Because we built the corridor." Nathan overheard the conversation while carrying fresh shells toward Frank Dawson's gun. "Built it." Frank chuckled. "Not with concrete." He pointed toward the valley. "With choices." Nathan looked confused. Frank continued loading another round. "Months ago, our engineers reinforced every bridge they wanted the enemy to cross, cleared every field they wanted them to drive through, left every road they wanted them to trust. They think they chose the fastest route." He looked toward Bennett. "Truth is, we picked it for them." Nathan stared across the battlefield with new understanding. The invasion was not unfolding by accident. It was following a script written long before the first alien ship entered Earth's atmosphere. Hundreds of miles away, satellite feeds confirmed exactly what Bennett expected. Alien formations compressed naturally as damaged navigation systems pushed more vehicles toward the same open lanes. Every correction they made only tightened the traffic flow. Human forward observers quietly updated coordinates by hand, speaking in calm voices over secure field telephones. Target line advancing as projected. Wind unchanged. Visibility reduced. Bennett acknowledged each report with a simple copy. There was never any excitement in his voice. To him, this was mathematics unfolding exactly on schedule. On the command carrier, Kaler's confidence finally began to crack. Deploy reconnaissance drones ahead of the advance. Minutes later, another report arrived. Drone feeds obscured. Use orbital sensors. Ground interference is increasing. Thermal. Unreliable. Kaler stepped closer to the display until he was only inches away from the shifting battlefield map. Find me their command center. An intelligence officer hesitated before answering. We cannot, sir. Why? Because every battery is operating independently. Another analyst added quietly. If we destroy one position, the others continue without interruption. Bennett watched another synchronized volley leave the line before speaking to Harper. Status on reserve batteries? Untouched. Ammunition? Ahead of schedule. Nathan looked around in disbelief. After everything they had already fired, crews were still working with the same calm efficiency as they had that morning. Nobody looked rushed. Supply trucks continued arriving. Replacement barrels waited under camouflage nets. Fresh crews rotated in while others grabbed quick drinks of water and checked handwritten firing logs. This was not a desperate defense. It was a system designed to keep going for as long as necessary. Then a young communications specialist sprinted toward Bennett carrying a headset. Sir, we intercepted enemy command traffic. Bennett accepted the headset without urgency. Through the translator came Kaler's unmistakable voice. Commit the Titan Walker Division. Advance all heavy assets immediately. If their artillery cannot be silenced from a distance, we will crush it from the ground. Bennett slowly removed the headset and handed it back. Harper studied his face. That is everything they have. Bennett looked toward the horizon where enormous silhouettes were beginning to emerge through the thinning dust. Good, he said quietly. Now they are finally bringing us the targets we have been waiting for. The ground trembled again, but this time it was not from the artillery. Nathan Brooks looked toward the eastern ridge and felt the air change. Massive silhouettes emerged through the lingering haze, each one towering above the trees, as though entire office buildings had decided to walk across the countryside. The Titan walkers had arrived. Their long mechanical legs stepped over rivers and abandoned roads without slowing, shimmering defensive fields wrapping around them like pale blue glass. Even from nearly 8 miles away, they dominated the horizon. Nathan swallowed hard. Those things are bigger than I imagined. Frank Dawson slid another shell into position without looking up. They are also exactly where the Major wanted them. Nathan stared at him. You keep saying things like that. Frank smiled. Because planning beats guessing every single time. Inside the command shelter, Captain Olivia Harper watched fresh reconnaissance reports arrive by field telephone. Lead Titans entering Sector Delta. Another operator immediately answered from a different observation post. Second formation moving through the northern corridor. Bennett calmly marked both positions with a grease pencil. There was no hesitation in his movements. Every route had already been drawn weeks earlier. Every likely decision had been discussed months before the invasion ever began. Harper studied the map. They committed every heavy unit. Bennett nodded once. Because Kaler believes large machines solve large problems. On the alien command carrier, High Marshal Kaler finally felt the battle shifting back in his favor. The Titan Walkers represented the greatest engineering achievement of the Velker Alliance. Their defensive fields had survived asteroid strikes. Their adaptive armor automatically redistributed energy across thousands of impact points. Entire civilizations had surrendered after seeing them march toward their capitals. One commander smiled confidently. Human artillery cannot possibly overwhelm layered Titan shielding. Another added, their ammunition reserves must already be running low. Kaler folded his hands behind his back. Once the Titans eliminate the artillery batteries, the humans will have nothing left except courage. He paused before adding quietly, "Courage is admirable. It is not a strategy." Back at Fort Adams, another synchronized volley echoed across the valley. This time, however, forward observers immediately reported something different. Rounds impacting. A brief pause followed. Titan formations continuing advance. Nathan overheard the transmission and looked toward Bennett. "Did we miss?" Bennett shook his head. "No, then why are they still moving?" Bennett closed the map folder and looked out across the battlefield. "Because they wanted us to believe they were unstoppable." Harper understood before Nathan did. "They strengthened the front." Bennett nodded. "Exactly." Several more reports arrived in rapid succession. Shield integrity remains stable. Enemy speed unchanged. Additional walkers entering range. For the first time that morning, the artillery crews noticed the alien machines refusing to break formation. Nathan glanced toward Frank. "What if this does not work?" Frank tightened his gloves and answered with complete honesty. "Then we try something else." Bennett stepped outside the shelter and watched the enormous walkers continue advancing through drifting dust. Their commanders clearly believed they had discovered the weakness in Earth's defense. He reached into his pocket, unfolded a weathered note card, and quietly compared one final set of handwritten numbers with the updated battlefield coordinates. Harper walked beside him. "You have been holding something back." Bennett smiled faintly. "Not something." He folded the card and slipped it away. "Someone." At that exact moment, a secure field telephone rang inside the command post. Harper answered first, listened carefully, then covered the receiver with her hand. "Sir," she said, "Colonel Mason Reed reports that his battery is finally in position." Bennett accepted the handset. "Colonel, can you see the Titans?" A calm voice answered from miles away, clear as day. Bennett looked once more toward the towering machines steadily approaching through the valley. "Good," he replied. "It is time to show them the difference between surviving artillery and understanding artillery." Colonel Mason Reed had been waiting for that phone call since before sunrise. Hidden nearly 18 miles north of Fort Adams, his battery sat deep inside an abandoned limestone quarry that had once supplied stone for highways stretching across Kentucky. From orbit, it looked deserted. From the air, it looked forgotten. That was exactly how Reed wanted it. He lowered the field telephone and looked at the men and women surrounding him. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed a speech. "Battery," he said in a calm voice. "Prepare special pattern echo." Crew chiefs immediately repeated the order. Long rows of artillery pieces, larger than anything Nathan Brooks had seen at Fort Adams, slowly rotated toward their assigned headings. These guns had remained silent all morning while the rest of Earth's defenses fought for every mile. They were never meant to fire first. They were built for moments exactly like this. Back at Fort Adams, Nathan noticed Bennett watching the distant ridgeline instead of the approaching Titans. "Sir," he asked quietly, "what is special pattern echo?" Bennett smiled without taking his eyes off the horizon. "It is what happens when someone spends 6 months convincing the enemy they already know your strongest move." Nathan frowned. "You let them think our artillery was fully deployed." "Exactly." Harper folded her arms. Every satellite image they stole showed the same batteries. Nathan's eyes widened. "Because these were never all of them." Bennett nodded once. "People usually stop looking after they believe they have found the answer." On the command carrier, Kaler leaned closer to the tactical display. Human artillery activity appeared unchanged. Every report suggested the same predictable firing rhythm that had continued throughout the battle. One intelligence officer looked relieved. "Their firing rate is slowing." Another added, "Thermal readings indicate several barrels approaching operational limits." Kaler finally allowed himself a small smile. "They have exhausted themselves." Before anyone could respond, another sensor operator suddenly stiffened. "Marshal, report. New thermal signatures detected." "Where?" "Northern sector." Kaler turned sharply. "Impossible. We cleared that region before the invasion." The operator enlarged the orbital image. Fresh artillery positions were appearing one after another beneath carefully concealed camouflage that had remained invisible throughout the entire battle. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became an entirely new firing line stretching across terrain the Velker command had already classified as strategically irrelevant. Silence spread across the bridge. "How long have they been there?" Kaler demanded. We We do not know. How do you not know? The officer stared at the display. Because they never transmitted. They never moved during daylight. They generated almost no detectable heat. At that same moment, Colonel Reed looked across his cruise. Final confirmation. Bearing locked. Elevation confirmed. Meteorological correction complete. Reed placed one hand on the weathered steel railing overlooking the quarry. Ladies and gentlemen, he said with an easy smile, let us introduce ourselves. Across the valley, Nathan heard a distant rumble unlike anything that had echoed through the battlefield before. It did not come from Fort Adams. It rolled in from the north like an approaching storm. Soldiers stopped loading shells for just a moment and instinctively looked toward the horizon. Even Frank Dawson laughed under his breath. There they are. Nathan turned toward him. You knew? Frank shrugged. I knew the major was smiling too much this morning. Bennett calmly checked his watch while the first reports arrived over the field telephone. Harper looked down at the notes being handed to her. Her expression shifted from concentration to quiet satisfaction. Colonel Reed reports every battery online. Bennett accepted the paper, glanced at the coordinates, and simply replied, then begin Phase 2. Hundreds of miles away, Kaler watched new impact predictions flood every tactical screen at once. They did not approach from the front. They did not match any known firing solution. They crossed his carefully protected formations from an entirely different direction, exposing angles his engineers had never considered defending. For the first time since the invasion began, High Marshal Kaler whispered words that none of his officers had ever heard him say before. We misunderstood them. The first reports from Colonel Mason Reed's hidden batteries reached Fort Adams faster than anyone expected. Captain Olivia Harper read them one after another, each update shorter than the last. Northern batteries on schedule. Enemy formations changing direction. Reserve ammunition holding. She looked up at Major Lucas Bennett. They are reacting exactly the way we modeled. Bennett accepted the clipboard without a trace of celebration. Good. That means they are still making decisions we understand. Nathan Brooks stood beside Frank Dawson, listening as the distant thunder from Reed's guns blended with the steady rhythm of Fort Adams. The battlefield no longer felt like one fight. It felt like several invisible battles unfolding at once, each one connected by people who trusted paper maps, field telephones, and years of preparation more than any computer ever built. I thought this was about bigger guns, Nathan admitted. Frank smiled while wiping dust from his gloves. That is what they thought too. He pointed toward the valley. It was never about bigger guns. It was about making somebody choose the wrong answer over and over again. Aboard the Velker command carrier, confusion slowly replaced confidence. High Marshal Kaler watched his tactical display fill with conflicting recommendations from artificial intelligence systems that had never encountered a battlefield like this. One program advised advancing. Another demanded retreat. A third insisted the human artillery network had somehow duplicated itself. Which assessment is correct? Kaler asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, his chief analyst spoke carefully. Marshal, all of them are based on the assumption that humans are protecting fixed positions. Kaler narrowed his eyes. They are. The analyst hesitated. I no longer believe they are protecting the guns. That sentence lingered in the command center. Kaler looked back toward the battlefield, replaying hours of combat data from the beginning. Human batteries had fired, relocated, paused, resumed, and coordinated across enormous distances without depending on the networks his forces had disabled. They had willingly exposed some positions while concealing others. They had allowed him to believe he was dismantling their strength when, in reality, he had only been measuring the part they wanted him to see. Back at Fort Adams, Harper unfolded another map Nathan had never seen before. Instead of artillery positions, it showed supply roads, fuel depots, temporary bridges, and evacuation routes. Nathan frowned. Why are we looking at logistics now? Bennett answered before Harper could. Because battles end. Nathan looked toward the horizon where distant columns of dust still drifted across the fields. This one does not feel close to ending. Bennett quietly folded the map. Exactly. That is why we planned for what comes after people stop following their original plan. At that moment, another secure transmission arrived from Reed. Harper listened, then looked at Bennett with visible surprise. Colonel Reed reports the Titan formations are splitting into smaller groups. Nathan smiled. That means they are breaking apart. Bennett slowly shook his head. No. It means Kaler has stopped trusting his own doctrine. Nathan's smile faded. Bennett continued. A dangerous commander is predictable. A desperate commander is not. Hundreds of miles away, Kaler dismissed half the tactical projections floating around him. Recall the standard assault pattern, he ordered. Form independent strike groups. Forget the invasion handbook. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. Marshal, those procedures have never been authorized. Kaler stared at the battlefield. Neither has losing. As new orders spread through the Velker fleet, alien formations began abandoning the routes Bennett had anticipated for months. Harper watched fresh reconnaissance reports arrive one after another. They are leaving the corridor. Nathan looked toward Bennett. Is that bad? Bennett remained silent for several long seconds before reaching for another folded envelope that had remained unopened since the battle began. He broke the seal, read the single page inside, and allowed himself the smallest nod. No, he said quietly. This is the decision we were hoping he would eventually make. Nathan blinked. You planned for him to change the plan? Bennett slipped the paper back into the envelope. No. He looked toward the distant horizon where the battle continued beyond sight. We planned for him to finally start thinking like a human. The sun was beginning to sink behind the western hills when the last battlefield reports reached Fort Adams. Captain Olivia Harper quietly placed the final stack of handwritten updates on Major Lucas Bennett's table. Unlike the digital displays that had failed hours earlier, these pages carried the complete story. Enemy advance halted. Reserve formations withdrawing. Orbital support repositioning beyond effective range. Bennett read every page without changing expression. When he finished, he simply closed the folder and looked out across the valley where drifting dust slowly settled over fields that looked strangely peaceful again. Nathan Brooks approached with his helmet tucked beneath one arm. His uniform was covered with dirt, his voice tired but steady. Sir, is it over? Bennett took a long breath before answering. The battle is. Nathan glanced toward the horizon. What about the war? Bennett smiled faintly. Wars rarely end in one afternoon. But sometimes one afternoon changes how every future war begins. Miles above Earth, High Marshal Kaler stood alone inside the command bridge while officers quietly dismantled tactical displays that no longer reflected reality. For the first time in his career, every prediction algorithm had failed him. Every assumption about humanity had collapsed under the weight of one simple mistake. He had believed advanced technology guaranteed advanced thinking. Instead, he had faced an opponent willing to trust experience, preparation, patience, and ordinary people doing ordinary jobs extraordinarily well. One of his younger officers finally broke the silence. Marshal, how could projectile weapons accomplish this? Kaler did not answer immediately. He looked down at a recovered image transmitted from the battlefield only minutes earlier. It showed an aging artillery crew calmly cleaning the steel barrel of a cannon between firing missions. No celebration. No dramatic speeches. Just professionals taking care of equipment that had already done its job. It was never the weapons, Kaler said quietly. It was the people behind them. Back at Fort Adams, artillery crews were already beginning the same routine they had practiced after every exercise. Barrels were inspected. Tools returned to storage. Empty coffee cups collected. Supply trucks rolled forward with replacement parts instead of applause. Nathan watched Frank Dawson carefully wiping dirt from the side of his trusted cannon. You really treat it like family, Nathan joked. Frank laughed softly. No, he rested one hand against the cool steel. Family comes first. This is just the reason I get to go home to them. Nathan looked toward Bennett, who was quietly folding maps and placing grease pencils back into a weathered metal case that looked decades old. There were no medals waiting for him. No television cameras. No grand ceremony. Harper handed him one final report. Washington wants a statement. Bennett raised an eyebrow. Tell them the soldiers did their jobs. They will probably want something more inspiring than that. Bennett looked across the valley one last time. Then tell them this. Harper waited while he chose his words. Technology matters. Training matters. But neither one means much if you forget the people carrying the weight. She wrote every word exactly as he spoke it. Months later, military academies across the galaxy would study the Battle of Fort Adams. Entire chapters would be written about hidden batteries, paper maps, redundant planning, and artillery doctrine. Engineers would redesign vehicles. Generals would rewrite invasion manuals. Historians would argue over tactics for generations. Yet the lesson that survived longer than any battlefield diagram came from a young private named Nathan Brooks. After returning home, someone asked him what it felt like to stand beside weapons that changed history. Nathan smiled, slipped his wedding ring back onto his finger after another long day of service, and answered with complete honesty. The history was never inside the guns. It was inside the people who refused to stop showing up for one another. And somewhere beyond Earth's skies, every commander who had once dismissed humanity as a primitive species quietly began teaching the same lesson to the next generation. Never mistake simple for weak. Never confuse patience with fear. And never underestimate a civilization that has spent centuries learning that the strongest weapon is not the one that looks the most impressive. It is the one trusted by ordinary people when everything they love is worth protecting.